I just want to start with these apologetics classes talking about some figure, and this one his name was Father Seraphim Rose. That's his monastic name. His name was Eugene Rose, born in 1934 in San Diego. His family was very successful, smart, belonged to Mensa. He is baptized in what's called the Methodist Church, but when he was 14, he rejected Christianity in favor of atheism. Goes to school, graduates magna cum laude in Chinese philosophy, then goes on to study, become an expert in languages and literature. And he was this voracious reader. And he said his search for truth, actually, even of Oriental spiritualities, kind of set this spark of spirituality. In 1962, he's received into the Russian Orthodox Church. 1965, starts St. Herman's Press. Later, feels a call towards more reclusive monasticism, so they start this community in Alaska, and they move to Alaska. And he was brilliant, wrote a lot, spoke about what's called quote-unquote orthodoxy of the heart, which he spoke about the need for warmth and kindness, especially dealing with people of other religions, because he thought Christians had become very rigid, that the most important things is loving kindness and long suffering and mercy towards others. And when he died and they laid out his body. All these people came, but his body, oddly enough, they say was incorruptible, that the days he was there it didn't corrupt, and when anybody went in to view the body, they said it always smelled like roses in the room. So my point being is that it's actually, I think, up for the process of canonization, but it is kind of amazing. In your early teenage years, so many of them turn atheist, and he's a good patron saint of somebody, the spark being lit towards Christianity or theism. And so I mention him because for him it was literature and reading that sparked his spirituality. And so the first class was on cosmological arguments about the cosmos. This one I like a lot more, and this is what I made this anthropological arguments. Anthropological means human-centered. So there's several. I'm just going to start with my favorite. My favorite argument for God is, anthropologically, is the moral argument. And the moral argument is this. I know this sounds kind of strange, but in fact, I was a little shocked by this myself. But I'm listening to a bunch of BK kids' confessions, right? We're having a confessional, and this kid comes up, and I'm not angry. I just appear that way 90% of the time. I mean, I don't really take what a 17-year-old says that serious, no offense. But, and you know when they're walking up, you can kind of tell, okay, I can read arrogance on this one. And he sits down, and in this very challenging, I say, the Lord be with you, and in this very challenging tone, he says, I don't believe morality exists. So I said, so if I put, I know this is going to be gross, if I put fish hooks in your eye and slowly pull out your eyeballs, you won't object because there's no such thing as morality. If I punch you in the face, you're not going to run home to I knew his family, to your very wealthy parents and sue me because there is no such thing as morality. And you could see the absolute shock on his face. And I said, oh, you're shocked, which means you do believe in morality. And I said, really, there's nothing in your life you feel guilty for? And he said, well, yes, there is. So you do believe in morality. So in essence, that's the moral argument. You can say there is no God, there is no morality, and yet really then why are you shocked by this stuff? Why are you saying, well, you shouldn't do stuff like that? You can't say, as somebody famously said, if you don't believe in God and you don't believe in morality, then never use the word should. Does that make it the moral argument? And typically atheists will say, well, morality is just a social contract. We all agree that we're just going to be, this is how we're going to behave. So sociopath. So that basically makes all of us well-behaved sociopaths. Why is it wrong to rape a 2-year-old? That is not because of a social contract. There is something deep within us that says that is intrinsically wrong. The intrinsic, that means inside, moral code is a proof of a God. And why is it? They've done all these studies. Even toddlers know cheating is wrong. They did this test with just little toddlers where they see somebody cheat. Toddlers know immediately cheating is wrong. Why are there cops and prosecutors who can't sleep at night after seeing a horrific crime? It's not because somebody broke the social contract. It's because they broke some deep-seated human law. This shouldn't happen. Implanted within us is this basic morality, a moral law. And God is the lawgiver behind the law, the source of all morality. Now, granted, some morality is subjective. I would argue that. Some is subjective. If, God forbid, I think it's funny. So, it's happened twice where somebody will get in an accident, they need to be driven to the emergency room, and the only person around was Patty Blazik. And Patty Blazik drives about 15 miles below the speed limit at all times. And so somebody had a heart attack. And I would be this way, I'm not going to explain it, but somebody had a heart attack, and Patty says, let me call 911. The guy gets upset and says, do not call it. I am not going in an ambulance. I actually get that. But so Patty says, okay, I'll drive you. And so he's in the front car in pain. And so Patty doesn't know what to do, so she starts to rub his hair. She wants to take his mind off the heart attack. She says, you have really soft hair. But the joke is, well, it's happened twice. And so my joke about Patty is, because I've driven with Patty once, and I said, Patty, I can get out and walk faster than you drive. So I said, Patty, if I ever have a heart attack and you're driving me to the hospital, please break the speed limit. That's a subjective morality. Yes, if there's an emergency, you're driving, there's some cases where morality is subjective. Does that make sense? Like, that's not a time to say, no, I always obeyed the speed limit. Some morality is subjective, and some morality is not. It is objective. Rape, cruelty, murder, all those things are wrong. That's an objective morality. And you're not taught that. You just know it from day one. And there's this very famous, actually he was a mathematician and professor, Kant. He was a German philosopher, mathematician. He was super, super brilliant. He was so brilliant that he never really wanted to leave his German village. So that was everything he needed to know was in this German village. And he's watching the waves in the ocean, and then starts calculating them, and he realized that the Earth's orbit that people had calculated was off just by the mathematics of the wave. This guy is smart. But he's not only brilliant, but he's also a philosopher of morality. I know math and morality usually don't go together, but at least in my book. He writes this critique of practical reason, and Kant concludes with this line, and I just like this line. Two things fill my mind with ever new and increasing admiration and reverence. The starry heavens above me and the moral law within me. And in the book, he makes this case that morality is implanted in you. There are some things that are just objective. within you. And that's one of the proofs of God. Years later, C.S. Lewis, who's, no offense, kind of a better writer, Kant is very difficult to read. C.S. Lewis makes it approachable. But he picks up Kant's insight and formulates, in my opinion, better language, an argument for God based on the reality of a moral law. And he does this in this book called Mere Christianity. I'm going to repeat this because I was very upset. BK took Mere Christianity off their reading list. It was one of the books that BK students had to read. And they took it off because one priest got upset because C.S. Lewis was Episcopalian. But he makes this Mere Christianity, he makes these arguments for believing in God. And several BK students said, of all the books they read, that's the one that convinced them of God. Because usually in their teenage years, they start to question everything. And one girl, I just like her, it's the moral argument that really convinced her. And according to Lewis, the only valid morality that exists is one that's objective. Subjective concepts of morality always run into ruin. A subjective morality is, if you're comfortable with doing something, that's fine. It's moral for you, but not me. I think there are cases for that, but that's very dangerous. When I was growing up in the 80s, I don't know if you noticed, I noticed this. In every sitcom where they dealt with the area of sex, and this somehow was supposed to be brilliant, did you ever notice every time they dealt with sex, the parent would say, when you feel it's right for you, it's right. No, it's not. No. That's terrible parenting. According to the moral argument, there are some universal human moral conscience, quote unquote. It's universal. It's beyond one's emotional state. It's more visceral than one's emotions or whether you feel like something or not. Some morality just is. And as I said, science seems to confirm that we are innately born with some basic morality towards justice. One of the interesting studies was not with toddlers, but with infants who are pre-language. And they had the infants, they had puppets, right? And they had these puppets, and they'd test these infants out. That one puppet would beat another puppet. And then they'd offer the infants the puppets. And guess what? To an infant, guess which puppet they always chose? The victim. None of them wanted to hold the brutal one. Or even more, like think about the Nuremberg trials. The Nuremberg trials, we had this genocide and forgot his name all of a sudden, medically experimenting on children. Mengele. Mengele. It was legal and therefore moral. And the argument was, no, you just know some things are wrong. And the amazing part, in Eichmann's trial, Eichmann was actually brilliant. He was very smart. And they're interviewing Eichmann, and this was a shocker. Eichmann mentions Kant. And he says, oh yes, I've read Kant. And he knew Kant's arguments for morality and God. And he says, and this is where he's wrong. And basically where he's wrong is if it's legal, it's moral. No. Some things, even if they're legal, are immoral. And C.S. Lewis, his argument works like this. There is clearly a moral law. If there's a moral law, then there's a moral lawgiver. Just as there are physical laws in the universe that speak about a divine intelligence, there's moral laws that speak about a divine will. And the moral argument, in my opinion, wins a lot of atheists over, or really confirmed. There's one woman, anyhow, she was an atheist. I think she has an interesting story. So she grew up, she was Canadian, but she grew up in the far south of Texas. And she was raised by non-religious people, but in Texas she fell in with all these fundamentalists. But what she noticed is that they were duplicit. They they would say that they're very Christian, but they wouldn't act that way. And her point being is that, if you want to turn people off from religion to atheism, just be duplicitous. Say that you're a Christian, but cheat on your wife. That ruins everything. So she grew up thinking Christianity is a bunch of BS. And then she was smart, and she starts to think that, she's a rationalist. And then she falls in with atheists. And she had this podcast of promoting atheism. And she meets this guy in Columbia, Joe, who was Columbia and then also a Harvard Law graduate. And she meets him, and he's a non-practicing Catholic, but he's brilliant. And she was shocked to find out that he could be so smart and claim to believe in God. And he said, I may not be a practicing Catholic, but I will never not believe in God. He said, I'm not the most moral person. I don't go to church regularly, but I will never not believe in God. So I know this outside. It's just meeting Joe. It kind of shocked her that somebody could still believe in God and be a non-practicing Catholic. And she said, in our age, what we seem to prize the most is being smart. In other ages, it was being virtuous. In the new atheists, the mantra is, we're just smarter than those people who believe in God. And she was shocked by this guy who could be so smart. She actually ends up marrying him. And what convinced him is that was his innate morality. He was not the most moral, but he tried to. Now, oddly enough, after they got married and have kids, they start practicing their faith. They become more moral. And she makes this argument that the immorality of Christians, you claim to believe in God, and then if you act duplicitously, why wouldn't some teenager believe in atheism? But the argument goes this way too. You meet somebody who's smart and, maybe not perfect, but they have a basic morality. That also can convince people. So she now is actually a very active Catholic. But that's kind of the moral argument. Or here's something from this atheist paper, that in the atheist paper they wrote, remember, being smart is the most important. It's better to kill babies than mature pigs, because pigs have a higher cognitive function than babies. And when she reads this argument, she's horrified. But at least she's honest enough to say, but that is my morality. She's horrified by the example. But yeah, she does judge people on their intellectual worth. And then she realizes that, society could come up with any reason they want to execute anybody. You can even come up with a reason to execute babies over pigs. And the more and more she's thought about this, it led her to the moral argument, and lo and behold, she does convert. Or, do you know about Megan's Law? Okay. Megan's Law, where it's a law now that if you're a child molester, perpetrator,
pedophile,
offender, sex offender, you're registered so everybody in the neighborhood gets to know where you are. Megan's Law did that. And what happened is that this girl, Megan, her family lived across the street from 3 people who were released from prison. And Megan goes to school but is found dead. And 3 people across the street were all sex offenders. And one of them had raped, and killed her. And they tried to catch him, and he actually, somehow he committed suicide or something, but there's never any justice for the family. So the family urged this passage of moral law, of this Megan's Law. And then in this interview, I thought this was amazing. There's this debate between Richard Dawkins, and Richard Dawkins is the Pope of atheists. He's arguing against this scientist. He's a famous mathematician, John Lennox, who's a well-known mathematician, but also a practicing Catholic. And John Lennox raises this because Richard Dawkins says there's no such thing as morality. I'll get in a second. And John Lennox says, then what about Megan's Law? And he said, well, it's just too bad. He said there is no such thing as justice. And John flips it using the moral argument, saying, well, if justice doesn't exist, then how can there be such a thing as injustice? Why would we pass Megan's Law? If there's no such thing as justice, there's no such thing as injustice. And Richard Dawkins said, this feeling for justice is just a product of evolution, but it's arbitrary. In Richard Dawkins, all morality is subjective. So John Lennox said, so raping a little girl is just an arbitrary evolutionary feeling. And he said, yes. Richard Dawkins said, quote, we just dance to our DNA, and some people's DNA is just meant to be sociopath. It's broken machinery. Well, they've done studies. Nobody's born a sociopath. It takes time to kill your conscience. Richard Dawkins thinks that the more intelligent you are, the more value you have. So somebody asked Richard Dawkins, if that's true, why shouldn't we do medical experiments on mentally handicapped people? Because they're not worth that much. Does that make any sense? Mm-hmm. The moral argument is that, no, morality exists. You have to work to kill it. To me, it's like our immune system. When we're born, we have an immune system, but it's only half developed. When you're born, we have a basic morality. It just has to develop. And yes, some people can kill it. So the atheist argument is this, and you'll hear this. The rebuttal is, it works something like this. Evil proves the non-existence of God. Now, does that make any sense? Because people say, well, if you believe in God, why is there so much evil in the world? Well, believe it or not, in St. Augustine's younger day, he thought that this also, that the existence of evil disputes the existence of God. But then he came to see that evil was an absence of good. That's how he defines evil. And put it this way, like a cut on your finger, that's a privation, an absence. Does that make sense? Like, it means evil is a privation. So if you cut your finger and there's a cut in it, a hole in it, that's the hole, the cut, is an absence. Does that make sense? And he says, if I cut my finger, it doesn't prove that the finger doesn't exist. Quite the opposite. The cut in the finger proves the finger exists. A shadow proves that there is light. Or C.S. Lewis used to say, to say the line is crooked, there has to be an idea of a straight line. When atheists say evil proves God, but if there is injustice in the world, doesn't that also prove that deep down we also believe in justice? The atheists, they're stealing from God's goodness and then trying to prove atheism. And the question is, well, does that make any sense, right? Like, actually, you could flip that argument around. Evil proves existence of God. And what is the atheist morality? Nietzsche said that the atheism in the 19th century would lead to genocide in the 20th. Look at Stalin. Stalin killed a lot more people than Hitler. Hitler said nature doesn't want the strong races to breed with the weak. He says that in Mein Kampf. Hitler, Stalin, Mao killed more than Stalin and Hitler combined. Huge, millions and millions. That's just applied atheist morality. Even Hannah, or you get these arguments, simply derivations of that. Why does God allow for pain? Not why does God allow for evil. Why does God allow for pain? If God could solve the problem of pain, why doesn't he? And since he doesn't, then there must not be a God. But atheism doesn't solve the problem of pain either. It simply removes it. It doesn't solve it. They say there is no evil and there is no morality. I could never be an atheist because there's no forgiveness and there's no ultimate justice. Whereas they say, if God exists, then the world wouldn't be as it is. That's a conclusion of what you think the world should act like. It's not evidence. That's a conclusion. When they say, surely a good God could create a world where there's no evil. Yes, but then we wouldn't be in it. If people couldn't choose evil, then it wouldn't be the world at all. God didn't make us Stepford wives. Do you remember the movie Stepford Wives? I mean, the recent one where all the wives were incredibly beautiful and so obedient to their husband, just as God intended. They're obedient, always well behaved, and then the guy discovers they're robots. They have no choice but to obey. And that would be us as well. There would be no evil, but there would also be no compassion, no real love. It would have the consciousness of a toaster. If your mom makes you breakfast in the morning, you appreciate it because she had the choice of not making breakfast. If your toaster makes you toast, you don't appreciate the toaster since it had no choice. If God made human beings with a choice to choose good or evil, that means we're not toasters. Or I like this. C.S. Lewis said, can God make you courageous if there's no such thing as danger? You know, it's facing danger that makes you courageous. So even other atheists actually have said the logical problem of evil doesn't do away with the existence of God, because it doesn't prove atheism either. Yes, there is pain and evil in the world, but I could also argue, as I tried to, that yes, that also proves God. Or C.S. Lewis said, I like this quote, God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks to us in our conscience, but shouts to us in our pain. Pain is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. So the argument is this. It's a consciousness, but you'll always get these like harsh arguments that are kind of shocking. Why does God allow babies to live? Oh, sorry. Why? Why does God allow babies to die? And no offense, because you have to kind of have some bullets in your pocket, just like Lila Slaggert hunting. Anyhow, so they'll say, why does God allow babies? If an atheist teenager says, why does God allow babies to die? Use this one. You mean like abortion? Because, atheists are for abortion. If you don't say that, I know that for a teenager can say that, but then you have to be really honest with them. If you don't know what to say when a baby dies, say nothing. Everybody here has known somebody who's lost a child, right? There's nothing you can really say. All you can offer is compassion. However, that doesn't mean I don't have a perspective. And I've told this story before. This moved me. So when I was in Idaho Falls, this young woman had lost a baby. And so at the morning mass, I'm a newly ordained priest. Not that, it was 2 years. We prayed for the woman and the child. And I said something I shouldn't have. I said, this is just tragic. This is a huge mistake. I shouldn't say anything. But after Mass, this woman, she was a really good woman, but she was in her 80s, and she was on a walker. She comes into the sacristy, and I'm just putting away things, and she says, Father, and she starts to cry. She says, when I was a young woman, I lost a child. And she says, it is the most painful thing. I carry that pain around with me today. She says, but my life was incredibly enhanced because I got to love that baby. I got to hold that baby in my arms for a few days and love that child. And she says, my life is made better because of it. Doesn't take away the pain, but my life has been enriched. And this young woman will realize one day that she's been blessed to love this child. And I like this line. She says, the truth is this. We only get a hold of each other for a few days or a few years, but we'll all lose somebody. It doesn't take away the value of that baby's life. Now, that's a perspective, not an answer. Does that make sense? So, at least with theism, it doesn't really answer why do babies die, but it gives you a perspective. The other issue is that when they ask questions like that, there's this supposition that God is there to make me comfortable. God is not obligated to make sure that we're comfortable. God is obligated to make sure we become mature. That means Christ-like. When atheists say, well, why does God allow pain and suffering? People want God to be the parent of a millennial who gives their children everything and never allows their children to think that, you have nothing to achieve. You're just special the way you are. God doesn't want to spoil us. He wants to raise us. That's why it says in the Bible, don't despise sacrifice and suffering. Sometimes sacrifice and suffering are the best things that happen to us. I told the story of my dad. My dad, who I did love, but he was a real pain. I don't know why I loved him, because it was a real pain. He was. When we were all little kids, even he says this. When we were little kids, he used to hug us, and where you didn't want to be hugged because it would take the air out of you, really. And he'd always say, "I love you, I love you, I love you so much." But then in junior high, he started to drink, and things got worse and worse and worse. My parents ended up getting divorced. Now, here's my dad. My dad was 6'3". Anyhow, I know. He was also black.
Would you say he's what?
My dad was 6'3", very smart. He had 5 masters and a PhD. He's in the Montana Hall of Fame for baseball and basketball.
What did your milkman look like?
Yeah. But he was, by definition of what makes for a good life, smart, athletic. He earned a little bit of money. Money was very important for him because he was born poor. But he gets ALS, and he's really angry for 1 month. And then things changed. And then he says he's going to come and visit all his kids for a week. We weren't really looking forward to that. So he comes to McCall. I'm in McCall, stays with me a week, and it was great. Like, we had a lot of fun. It was just wonderful. And even when he got ALS, also his language became, you could understand him, but I think this is funny. So we go to the McCall Brew Pub, and we're gonna have a beer, and so the waitress comes over and says, "Oh, what do you want?" And I ordered my beer, and she says to my dad, "What would you want?" And he says, "I want that," and that's how he spoke it. So she says, "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that. I want that." Oh, I didn't quite get that. And she's looking at me. So then my dad looks at me, and I said, "Oh no, you were a jerk to me in high school." So, so I'm joking. But so then my dad says, "I want a wrecking bell." So then I did help. And so I'd go up to Montana and visit him. We actually had a great time. After he left, I thought this is funny. My oldest sister called and said, "Well, how was it?" And I said, "It was great." And she says, "I know, why couldn't we grow up with that guy?" So once when I was up visiting him, he had a ALS for a year and a half. And he's walking me to my car, and I'm saying goodbye, and he says, "Don't feel sorry for me. The best thing God ever gave me in my life was ALS. He said, the only time in my life I've been happy is when you were all little kids and the last year and a half. He said, in between, all I was angry. And like, you'd go to daily mass, and he was truly happy. So why would God visit ALS upon human race, or pain and suffering? It's not an answer, but so ALS was like the cross for my dad, and it saved him. It made him a happy person. We'd say the cross is the way to joy. It's not an answer, it's a perspective. I could repeat that story in parishioner stories 1,000 times. So why does God allow suffering? I don't know why God allows particular evils to occur, but I can see how tragic events in general make people better and more committed to compassion and forgiveness and love. Like Nelson Mandela, he wouldn't have been a great leader of his country unless he could conquer his anger. In his years in prison, he writes about how he conquered his anger. Then he could lead his country to rebirth and unity. Without the suffering of the prison, he wouldn't have been a great leader. And think about this. We believe in the cross. We believe that in the Eucharist is this way of weekly sacrifice. So over a lifetime, we're formed into this body of Christ that's transformed to be this action of love and justice in the world. Yes, God has all power. God could wipe away all evil. But think about this. If God gave me the power for 24 hours of being omnipotent, I would change the world. But if God gave me also all wisdom, maybe I wouldn't change anything in order to change human beings to help themselves to better the world. Does that make any sense? Without power, yeah, maybe God would do away with all suffering. But with wisdom, maybe he chooses a better way. So answering evil as a problem is a problem for Christianity. But there is an answer. It's a bigger problem for atheists because they have no answer. Like Job, we do have a perspective, not a contradiction. The answer to evil is just a contradiction for atheists. The world for us, we'd say, is not meant to be a resort. It's a gym. The atheist's problem with evil is that they hold the world is supposed to be this resort. And since there's evil in the world, and this is not a resort, then apparently there is no God. But we're the ones who are charged into turning the world into someplace good with and through God's help. Atheists have no responsibility to change the world. So how does atheists define evil? That is, God is cruel. Richard Dawkins said in this one debate, I thought this was amazing, and I'll bring this up later. John Lennox said to him, he said, if I could give you irrefutable belief, proof in God, absolute proof in God, would you believe? And he said, no, I wouldn't, because God is a sociopath. He says, look at what God does in the Bible. God is a sociopath. Well, Richard Dawkins, he says we just dance to our DNA, so there is no evil. To me, it's stealing morality. And what I mean by that is this. Atheists want to think of themselves as better, but they're like cattle rustlers. They can't account for how they got their cattle. Or like Bertrand Russell, who's the grandfather of atheism, gave this intellectually honest description of atheism, where he said, quote unquote, we must build our lives on unyielding despair. He admits that atheism has no objective morality, and yet he himself was this outspoken critic of the war and abuse. And he's the one who admitted, well, technically atheists should never use the word should, because all things are permitted, but there shouldn't be war. And he admitted that's an intellectual dishonesty. He said he found his own beliefs incredible, meaning lack of credibility. So it's inconsistent for an atheist to say people shouldn't do X because there is no such thing as morality. Bertrand Russell admits that faced with genocide and horrific crimes, he said, everything in me cries out that it's wrong, but there is still no moral code. Or Ayn Rand said, since there is no God, live totally for yourself. It's logical to live selfishly. No one will hold you accountable. It makes no difference if one is a Stalin or a saint, and sacrificing for others is stupid. So you take those things that are most meaningful to human beings, and atheism deletes it. Bertrand Russell says there is no meaning of life. There is no love. It's just a chemical reaction. Well, you take the most meaningful things of life, self-sacrifice and love, and you making meaningless. So that's what I mean. They borrow capital from God, and then they return nothing. They live in a world where other people believe in morality and fight for justice and against genocide, and it allows them to live a more comfortable life. And then they mock that morality. When I say they're stealing from God, it's like people who don't pay taxes, which I think is a terrible. We live in the United States. We live in the best. Living in the United States gives us great opportunities. Does that make sense? It pays for police, and firefighters, and fire trucks, and all this. I may not fully agree with how my government spends it, but the United States has given me a very comfortable life. People don't pay taxes. They live in the comfort of being an American, but they contribute nothing. Atheists live in a world where those who fight for morality make it a better place, and then they say they don't believe morality exists. They're like people who don't pay taxes. So I find it incredible that atheists could say, well, see, atheism proves God. No, quite the opposite. An inborn morality speaks about a lawgiver. So when they say, well, why does God allow evil? They never say, why does God allow pleasure? Because many people misuse pleasure as well to cause evil. So that's my first favorite one. I spent way too much time. I saw you checking your watch. But I think it's I think it's my favorite of the anthropological, well, not my favorite. But I think it's a great argument. Does that make sense? And none of those questions are impossible to answer. Why does God allow evil? Why does God allow... You can answer all those, even to a 17-year-old. So, questions, objections? Yes?
Do you or can you differentiate natural law from moral law?
I don't know. So
Are they the same?
essentially, they are the same. I have a problem with moral law. Sorry. I don't have a problem with moral law. I have a little problem with natural law because people have misused natural law. Like Hitler misuses it. So I like the idea of innate moral law. You know something is wrong. Yeah. Anybody else? Okay, I went way too long on that. Sorry. But, is it next week? So, I'm just going to add one more adult ed class because I'm not going to get through all this. So, the second one, and this is mine, but I like it. I call this the neurological argument, which I know sounds strange, but they've done tons of research on neurology. And the first one is this. This happened when I was at St. Mark's, so it was like 20 years ago, where these two researchers, and I've mentioned this before, you'll get it. They repeated this 1,000 times. He was kind of curious what parts of the brain light up when you pray. And so he took 50 Franciscan nuns, had them pray the rosary, and put it in an MRI to see what parts of the light. Then took 50 Buddhist monks. Slight difference, but the same parts of their brain light up. And in the book, Why Won't God Go Away? It's not making a theological point. They're not even theologians or scientists. But what they say is that with all the research, I'm editing down, why God won't go away is because the concept of God doesn't seem to be a matter of software of programming people to believe in it. It's hardware. Our brains, certain parts are designed to light up when we pray. Why God won't go away? It's hardware, not software. That was really shocking. But they made all these other discoveries, such as like meditation on health and happiness. If you meditate, you have better health, more cerebral frontal activity. Medicine is more effective. You test out to be happier. You can concentrate longer, less heart problems, lower inflammation. If prayer is biologically, neurologically healthy, doesn't that, to me, speak of a creator? Why does meditation have such effect, even like on our telomeres? You can look that up. On our telomeres, it turns on and off good genes. It creates the best possible version of you. Why would meditation do that unless we're designed to? Now, evolutionary biologists hypothesize that religion simply improves solidarity in the community, so we invented it. But that's not what the research proves. Our minds are designed to pray. Also, longitudinal studies prove that prayer, meditation, improves health, optimism, our chance of survival. You know what blue zones are? Do you guys know what those are? Blue zones are, there's certain places in the world where people just live a lot longer. That's called a blue zone. And all the blue zones, they practice religion. Religion is associated with living longer. If that's true, then wouldn't atheism be illogical? Meditating on thankfulness and joy actually changes the way your brain works. Prayer literally reforms your neural pathways. So we're not merely, as Richard Dawkins said, bags of chemicals. That's what Richard Dawkins. No. With and through prayer, we can actually evolve and change and rewire our brains. So if there was as much evidence that meditation was bad to you as there is, like there's no evidence meditation is bad for you. But think about this. If atheists did have proof that meditation was bad for you, they would use that as proof that there is no divine. Does that make sense? If prayer made you a more awful person, believe me, they would use that argument. So I flip it around and I say, well, neurologically, if prayer is so incredibly healthy for us, doesn't that also speak of the divine? If we're hardwired to pray, that speaks of God. So that's what I called. I invented that. But I invent a lot of things. There's a lot more arguments. The third one I'm going to call positive psychology. Psychology, when it started, was just about abnormal psychology, what's wrong with people. But then, a few years ago, they started to say, well, what's right with people? Rather than diagnose the crazies, why can't we use psychology to say, well, here are the skills that make people better? So, positive psychology is a lot about happiness. And they had this one study, Pursuit of Happiness study. 86% of people who practice religion weekly test out to be happier. It doesn't say those who believe in God test out to be happier. Those who regularly, weekly practice have less depression, better marriages. And Martin Seligman, he's a positive psychologist, he proved that loving relationships make us the most happy. But if religion increases healthy marriage, commits people to love and community, wouldn't that support positive psychology, that it doesn't, that religion, and therefore the belief in design, prove God? Or the Grant study, I've mentioned that before, it's a 75-year study of Harvard graduates. It's the longest, most depth study on human beings. And for 75 years, they try and figure out, well, what does make for people to have happy lives? What's the ingredients of happiness? And So I'm going to read this off, but think how this parallels religion. Happiness is one, happiness is love. But religion teaches love, hospitality, companionship, community. So therefore you have a higher probability of happiness. Meaning, secondly, meaning is connected with happiness. This is what the Grant study found. But we literally confirm people, we smear oil on them, that their life has a purpose and a meaning, that they become an instrument. Atheism teaches life has no meaning. Third, like positive psychology proved that in this Grant study, coveting is very bad for you. Positive psychologists teach that comparative living leads to unhappiness. Does that like? But that also reminds me, doesn't religion teach that too? Also, if you want to be happy in the Grant study, fourth is you have to learn habits of forgiveness. Christopher Peterson said, without skills of forgiveness, not belief. We all believe in forgiveness. I do. I'm just not really good at it, but I'm Irish. Without skills of forgiveness, you end up bitter and angry. Doesn't religion teach that? Gratitude exercises. St. Ignatius, if you know the examen, you have to practice gratitude exercises. Positive psychology have found people who regularly, they've done tons of studies on this. Basically, you take two groups. What's the first study? This group, you test out their happiness, you test out everybody's happiness. But with this group, they give you the job of, at the end of every day, name 5 things you're grateful for. And just replay them in your mind. This group, you do nothing. This group always ends up happier. So gratitude exercises is part of positive psychology, but that's literally part of Catholicism. So if positive psychology, if the ingredients of what makes for a happy life is also the very things for 1,000 years religion has been teaching, doesn't positive psychology hint towards the divine? Does that make sense? Questions, objections?
Have they done any studies comparing happiness between atheists and people who have a belief?
No.
Because the way you're describing it, atheists should be miserable, unhappy, angry people.
Yeah. But I didn't find any studies there. But atheism is really fairly new. I mean, it's not, but it is.
When they deny that they were unhappy.
That's true.
Yeah, that's true.
But you can't test out happiness. Oh yeah, way back there. Okay, I have to repeat this because I'll get lost. She goes back to school, takes 8 credits of abnormal psychology, and the teacher plays back recordings of unhappy people. And they found that a lot of these people were angry at God who were very unhappy. I didn't hear that last part, but I know she's from Minnesota.
They were having mental health problems.
Oh, they're having mental health problems. Okay, anybody else want to share? Oh, okay, go ahead.
Doesn't atheism kind of just give permission for self-credit? Like not looking for happiness, but take a lot out just so people can credit themselves for everything they do that
I think it allows it more than us. But like I have 2 friends who are atheists, and they're very, very, very good people. So I don't think we have to be careful blanket statements, but and there's Christians who take credit for everything, even though technically we believe it's really God working through us. But I think you are right. It allows for it. It allows people to take credit that they have nothing to be grateful for because they think they've achieved it all. So.
What about agnostics?
Yeah, I never know about agnostics. Agnostics are those who aren't sure, which my joke is, why would you want to go through life behind the question mark? Make a decision. And this is another one of my little dichos. Evidence demands a verdict. Like, you have to go through life with some sort of verdict. Either you believe or you don't believe. Be like the guy who, well, when he met him, he could say, yeah, I do believe in God. I just don't really practice it. I mean, I think evidence demands a verdict. Just saying, well, I choose not to make a verdict, it seems so silly to me.
I thought by definition agnostics believe there is a higher power, but they haven't decided what higher power or how it interacts.
Well, this is just about theism. Either you believe in, this is all this class is, theism versus atheism. But if it's a higher power, then it's still theism. Agnostic means I don't know.
There was recently a debate in London that you can get on YouTube about Jordan Peterson, who's a psychologist, very popular right now, and Sam Harris. And I actually don't know what Sam Harris, he's a psychologist or what he is. He stands out for the atheist viewpoint.
Okay, so there's a debate in England between Sam Harris, who's a very famous atheist. I think he's a historian. He's one of the 3 top atheist apologists, and psychologist Jordan Peterson.
Yeah. And then there was a third person that was from Britain, and he didn't say much. But at the end of the debate, it was like 2 hours, the moderator, the one I didn't know, said, if every atheist was like Sam Harris, who made a rational argument for a rational world with love against religion that seems to be fighting so much among religions and among moral codes and stuff, we would be a lot better off. This is a post-Christian new world that they're proposing. Or post.
Okay, I have to stop so I can announce that. The moderator says, if every atheist was like Sam Harris, the world would be a better place. Go ahead.
But that's not a realistic proposal, because after Sam Harris lives his life, everything is hell. Basically, what he said, because having religion or having love with a rational, proposal, like he said, would fall apart very quickly. Because, love would be more identified with God.
Okay, so you said, but after, I forget,
After Sam Harris dies, that generation that could maintain rationality with love, after that generation, everything would dissolve into hell.
So after Sam Harris, everything's going to go to hell in a handbasket. I do know what she's speaking of. So Sam Harris, I'll talk about him next class. But he came out with a book recently of Morality for Atheism. It's his attempt to answer the moral argument. But the book was loved by atheists. But in the book, he says, you can let logic be your morality. Well, there's several problems with that premise. One is that Hitler could have logical reasons to kill all Jews. Stalin did. Mao did. You can always find some excuse and then call it rationalism to commit evil. So then Sam Harris takes the position, well, you base morality on what I think it was called well-being. It leads to a well-being life. But the problem with that is that what is well-being? He never defines it. Because believe it or not, my dad's well-being By the way, he died penniless because of medical bills. My dad's well-being in life was best with ALS, being penniless, physically constrained. That's when he was his happiest. So trying to say, well, logically what will make me well-being is wealth, well-being is not logical. Does that make any sense? Like, what you think will make you the most happy never rationally is true. How do you define well-being? Anybody who's lived long enough knows that what makes you happy as a 20-year-old does not make you happy as a 60-year-old. So I thought it was a really silly book. He tries to answer well, you can have morality based on rational, logical rules. I haven't seen any proof of that. And in his book, he doesn't really prove it. He just says, well, it's just well-being. Now, everybody would agree well-being is when you have a nice house. Well, I don't think that's true. I know plenty of people with nice houses who are miserable. Or, you can't, I don't think you can parse it that way.
I think he lost the debate.
Right?
Even if it's 2 hours long.
Yeah, I don't really, I'll talk about Sam Harris next week, but I just don't, I don't see how logic leads to morality. You can justify anything. So,
I think in Jesus' day, there were fewer people unhappy with their father as you. I grew up similar situation. Angry, hateful, resentful toward my father. I'm past that now, praise the Lord. But I think the people that are angry at God, like you spoke of, I think it's many, if not most of them, that extends to their relationship with their earthly father. So when Jesus taught us to pray, Our Father, who art in heaven, that's kind of a liability nowadays. Because people think, oh, my earthly father is such a jerk.
yeah,
How am I going to get to God?
I asked my sister that because I mean, here's the odd part. Even though my dad had a drinking problem and anger issues, I always loved him. He annoyed me. I actually stopped speaking to him for 7 years. But I'm Irish. We do that. And the only reason why I started speaking to him is that his best friend called me into his office and said, it's killing your dad. If you believe in love, can't you forgive your dad? I know he wasn't perfect, but you're killing him. And the odd part is that, so I asked my sister, I said, I once asked her, I said, do you have trouble believing in God because our dad was such a pain in the rear end? She says, no. When it says father, I know it doesn't mean just like my father. So, I don't know, my sister and I could separate it. And even if you have a really lousy parent, you still love that parent. I shouldn't say he was a lousy parent, but he certainly got on my nerves. So, all right. So, let's see. I could go one more. I just don't. Well, I'll go one more, and then we'll have to. I'll go one more. Do you guys mind?
No.
Okay. This is real quick. Fourth argument would be consciousness. The principle of consciousness is there is a self, right? But we can't define what the self or consciousness is. This is also called, quote unquote, the problem of the mind. Because mind and consciousness is not the same thing as your brain. We know we have consciousness, but we physically can't locate it. So if atheists can only accept things that are empirically true, what about consciousness? It can't be empirically located. The same way that we know that there is such a thing as consciousness, even though we can't physically locate it, we just know it's in and through us. Can't we say the same thing about God? That God is in and through us and even beyond us. But we can't physically locate God. Just because you can't physically locate something doesn't mean it's not true. Otherwise, what is consciousness? Does that make any sense? Okay, now, for me to get in the next one, it will take a lot longer. So we'll meet next week. We'll do point number 6. But I also want to do this, because I hear this. I want to, in the next class, also do this. People say, well, what evidence do you have of God? What evidence do you have of God? I just want to take the term evidence and talk about, well, depends what evidence you permit. Does that mean, like, if you just don't permit, if you say, well, I'm only going to accept this evidence, well, that's how they phrase that question. So, other than that, well, have my 10:15, 10:45. So anyhow, I'll see you next week. Thank you for the coffee and donuts.